Well, it's a few minutes after the hour. I think we can go ahead and get started. Very grateful to all of you for joining, and I'm going to start us off today. Uh, we're here, as you know, to talk about when the unthinkable becomes normal, how to talk to your child about mass shootings. My name is Matt Beal. I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I am the division chief of child psychiatry at Georgetown University Medical Center in Washington, D.C. I'm also the chief medical officer of Fort Health, and I'm delighted to be joined today by two colleagues and friends who I'll ask to introduce themselves. I'll first turn over to Dr. Lindsay Henderson. Lindsay, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Matt. I'm Lindsay Henderson. I am a clinical psychologist working with children and adolescents, and I'm the clinical director for Fort Health. Dr. Koplowitz?
Hi, I'm Harold Koplowitz. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I'm the founder and the medical director of the Child Mind Institute, who are partners with Fort Health in our mission of making sure that every child has quality mental health care.
Harold and Lindsay, thank you so much. Really glad to be here with you today. I know that I speak on behalf of both of you when I say that this is a subject that we wish we did not have to discuss. And yet it is abundantly clear that parents are craving guidance and feedback and support around this issue. We could advance to the next slide. As of February 20th of this year, we were 51 days into the year, and there had already been 83 mass shootings in the United States. That's an average of 1.6 shootings per day. Believe it or not, this is so far an improvement over last year, over 2022, when there were an average of 1.77 shootings a day, with a total of 647 mass shootings for the year. For the purposes of today's conversation, we're defining this term, mass shooting, as a shooting in which at least 4 people, other than the shooter, are injured or killed. We're not going to get into semantics. Regardless of precise definitions, it's clear that these events, no matter how they're defined, cause enormous trauma in the communities in which they occur. And in a world of massive, constant media coverage and communication, no matter where these events physically occur, they also deeply affect our sense of the safety of our children and our families and our other loved ones, no matter where we live. Next slide, please. Thank you. These unthinkably awful events have become commonplace. They become a normal part of our lives. And as a result, mass shootings are constantly in our collective consciousness. They're part of how we think about our world. They're part of how our children think about our world. Children also have daily reminders in the form of active shooter drills at school, metal detectors at school and other community buildings. Many of you may have seen stories about an undergraduate student at Michigan State University who was present on campus when a mass shooting took place earlier this month. Somehow it wasn't surprising to learn that that same young woman experienced a mass shooting at her high school just a few years prior. Next slide, please. Clearly, these events have the potential to impact the mental health of our children, as well as our own mental health as parents and as caregivers. This is part of the job description now, as much as we don't want it to be. Next slide, please, Shai. Thank you. Today's presentation will be focused on what you as parents and caregivers can do to communicate about these events with your children and your families. We'll talk about how you can support your child and help yourself cope with feelings of fear and anxiety that arise for many of us in the context of these events. Ultimately, this session today is designed to provide building blocks toward bolstering your child's resilience in the face of a phenomenon that unfortunately does not seem to be disappearing anytime soon. To do this, we've gathered this panel of child mental health experts who will offer parents and caregivers of children of all ages some insight and advice, as well as an opportunity to ask questions and to have a discussion together. Go to the next slide, Shai. Thank you. as we're finding the right slide, I'm going to start to set the scene for our discussion. Harold and Lindsay, you both know that there's been an enormous amount of research about the impact of traumatic experiences on children. We know from this research that children are very sensitive to their environments. We know that brain development takes place primarily in childhood. And we know that overwhelming or terrifying experiences can have a large impact on children's development. At the same time, we're learning more and more about resilience. Many children weather traumatic experiences relatively well. Many children grow up in adverse circumstances and still thrive. As clinicians, we're focused on utilizing findings from developmental science to help the adults in children's lives, particularly parents and teachers, to buffer the impacts of trauma and adversity so that our children can flourish. Dr. Koplewicz, I'm hoping to start with you. Your latest book is called Scaffold Parenting, and it's a really, really useful guide in teaching parents and caregivers how to raise resilient children. This is really the backbone of the book. Generally speaking, what would you say is the role of parents and caregivers in helping children to build resilience in the face of these kinds of events?
So, Matt, first of all, thank you for moderating today and for putting this symposium together. I think this is really the most important thing parents can do is to support their kids in good times and bad times. And talking to kids about difficult events, including school shootings, is really important. Kids actually feel less scared when they get to talk about scary things. I think the way to remember that is if you look at fairy tales, the fairy tales are so scary that, clearly that's the imagination of a child. And if you break down the reality, it's almost always less scary and better. So you can answer their questions and assure them that they're safe and that horrible events like school shootings are very rare. But you can also take a little pressure off yourselves by understanding that adults listening to children is more important in this kind of situation than knowing the perfect thing to say at that moment. And in fact, if you say the wrong thing, parenting is one of those things where you have mulligans. You can say, well, I made a mistake. Let's take that again. Let's do that one more time. So if you aren't sure what to say, you can always ask your kids if they have any questions. Sometimes a comfortable and safe setting where kids are allowed to be sad, to be upset, to be confused is the most valuable thing you can offer.
That's terrific. Thank you. And I've learned from you, Harold, that oftentimes the place to start is, so what have you heard?
Yeah.
Or, what are kids talking about at school? Or what did you hear from teachers? Or what are you hearing about? Or did you hear about this thing that happened? What did you hear? And just getting a sense of the starting place that your child is coming from. Lindsay, as when we talk about children or children and adolescents, we can be talking about quite a broad developmental range. And I'm curious if you can help us to think about, for example, we'll make up some ages. How might you talk to a child who's 6 versus how you might talk to a child who's in middle school, 11 or 12, versus a 16-year-old who's in high school? How do you as a clinical psychologist use your developmental training to think about these different ways in with kids at different ages?
Yeah, Matt, it's a good question. The first thing to keep in mind is that every child is different, no matter what age they are, and that we as parents know our children best. We don't have to have all the answers, but we do know our children better than any parenting guide does, right? So when children are younger, it's mostly about, as Harold said, creating, throughout their lifetime, a safe place where their feelings are valid, where they know that their feelings make sense, and where they know that they can talk about what's scary. So that's consistent across the lifespan, even into adulthood. For little kids, for younger kids, it's about giving simple explanations, keeping it very kind of high level, simple, but also factual. Reminding them that they are safe, or that there are people and systems in place to protect them, and that although it's terrible, these things are going to happen far away, or it happened, these things are quite rare. Having that perspective put in place where, yes, it's a terrible thing, and also there are things put in place that protect them. As they get older, again, responding to what they're bringing up, answering questions, and layering on kind of a little bit more info about what's going on for them and how they can best cope with it. One of the things that's important for any age is to limit the exposure to some of the media and news events. I think we can all relate to how scary it is to see the coverage, and the pervasive nature of the media coverage can make it feel a bit bigger, meaning more kind of close and common than it actually is, in a very scary way. So limiting talking about the graphic or upsetting details. As they get, again, older, in teens, that is makes a little bit more sense to explore whether it's okay to kind of talk about the bigger ideas, more complex beliefs or interpretations, or kind of calls to action as kids get older and want to do something about about any aspect of these shootings. So, again, sticking with the facts, meeting them where they're at, not giving them too much info, and helping them sort of talk about their feelings and know that these things are common and normal.
Yeah, that's super, Lindsay. And as you said, each kid is different. And I think we can all think of 6-year-olds who are curious and loquacious and process information in real time, and others who take a long time to process and may have questions a week or 2 weeks later. And so starting with, as Harold said, with what questions do you have? What would you like to know? I think is really valuable. Can either of you speak to some specific differences that we may see perhaps in some of the patients that you see in your practice? For example, kids with anxiety, or kids with depression, or kids with autism. How might kids with some of these differences, how might parents think about approaching conversations with their kids who may have some of these challenges pre-existing any exposure to a traumatic event like this?
So let's
Harold,
remember, well, I was going to say, let's reiterate what Lindsay said, which is limit the exposure, but also check what your kids already know and what they may be worried about. And also state to them that if they don't want to talk about it now, or they can't think about what they're worried about, that you're available at any time. Because this is not a one time, unfortunately, this is not a one and done. This is one of those things that's going to be an ongoing conversation as thoughts come up. I think in particular for anxious kids. So a kid who is anxious worries about things that don't need worry. And so here is something that actually could be worrisome, but don't forget they catastrophize. So if, and the other thing we should always remember is that children in general are very egocentric. So that if it happened to someone else, they're really worried, will it happen to me? And so very often keeping conversations brief, keeping them very realistic, reassuring them about the fact that their school is safe, that they have security guards, that the principal's really smart, that he talks to the teachers, that they have a drill, that your school is really protected. And we wouldn't send you to that school if we didn't think it was safe, because that's the number one priority for us, is to make sure that you're safe. So I would also always guide yourself by the questions. If don't oversell, don't give them too much information. Answer their questions with the understanding that they can always have more. I mean, I remember, at the time that Clinton was under impeachment, everyone was talking about, the sexual acts that occurred in the White House. And a colleague of mine called me very upset that morning his daughter said to him, who was in 3rd grade, "Tonight, I really want to talk about what's going on in the White House." And the parents called me and said, do we talk about oral sex? I said, just be very careful and listen to the question, and then answer as much as you can. And if you don't feel comfortable, you can always say, I need to get more information. So that evening they were very worried. Dinner came, and the child said, I don't understand why they're interns in the White House. Don't interns belong in the hospital? And the parents explained that internship is a training position, and that was it. There was no question about what the intern did to the president did to the intern. So they were ready to share a tremendous amount of inappropriate information that was clearly intellectually and emotionally above this child's psychological level. So remember, listen carefully to your child, try to answer the question being asked, and if you can answer it, it's perfectly normal to say, let me think about it. I'm going to talk to your doctor. I'm going to talk to mom about it, and I'm going to get back to you with an answer. So it's not a verboten kind of don't ask us those questions. It's just that I need more time.
Right. I think that bears repeating again and again tonight is the idea that it doesn't have to be one perfect conversation. It can be a series of conversations. I want to just make an aside that we would really love to have questions tonight, and please type your questions, as one of you already has, into the Q&A section of Zoom. We'll be tracking questions, and we're going to come back to them, to as many as we possibly can in the second half of the session. Lindsay, turning to you, anything that you think about in terms of tailoring responses or conversations about these topics for different kinds of kids?
No, I agree. Dr. Koplowitz was a great example of how sometimes we make things a bit more complex than they need to. We anticipate too much, and just waiting and listening for what is actually going on in your child's head is important. I think it also bears repeating that if your child is, if he does not bring it up, if they are not worried about it, if they do not have questions, that also is very developmentally normal. As Harold said, kids are very egocentric. They are focused on what's going on with them. And sometimes that gives them blinders to some of the things that seem so insurmountable and scary to us. They also are growing up in an environment where this is just sort of commonplace, for better or worse. And there's some, for better, that means that this is not a new phenomenon. They don't remember a pre-school bombing drill. This is sort of their norm, and that's okay as well, because when we think about it, it's just normalizing the preparation and the kind of rote drills and practice for very rare and probably not going to happen events. So I think, again, if your child is anxious, we talked about things like not promising things, giving them real life solutions, pointing to things that are evidence that there are safeguards in place. For kids who are depressed, helping kiddos learn to name the feelings that they're experiencing, to not isolate or avoid. It is, when we think about it, we approach treatment as managing someone's big feelings, whether those feelings are fear and worry, or whether they're sad, or whether they're kind of angry feelings. You're managing big feelings. And it's the same approach here, just teaching them kind of how to put words to what's going on in their head, and how to get the help for the things that they're experiencing.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. As you're making so clear, we have unfortunately too many opportunities to talk to our children about these events, given their frequency. And I think we really want to strike a balance between informing children about what's going on in the world and shielding them from an absolute onslaught of difficult information. Finding that balance, as we all know, can be very challenging. You mentioned school drills, Lindsay, as something that's become part of kids' everyday lives. Harold, your colleague at the Child Mind Institute, Dr. Dave Anderson, recently spoke about the soaring sales of Tuffy Packs, which are bulletproof backpacks. I mean, it's extraordinary that we even have to talk about this item, but we do. On your website, the Child Mind Institute wrote specifically about media coverage of the sales of these backpacks. Does this kind of military grade preparation help kids or scare kids more than it's worth? If so, what could mitigate that?
Yeah, I think you got to step back, and you don't have to take the bait. I don't know what the sales of Tuffy bags are, but I certainly think it's dramatic enough, it's exciting enough, it's stimulating enough that you could think your kids would care about that. And I think the plus side of this kind of publicity is we are conveying to our kids that we want them to feel safe. Not that they need a Tuffy bag, but that we care about their safety. It's the reason why we go to the end of the block, we wait for the light to turn green, and we cross the street. Even a 4-year-old who's had a caring parent knows that you don't cross the street when it's red, and an anxious kid doesn't cross the street when it's yellow. They know that there are rules, and kids love rules and regulations. As a downside, though, we are reminding children when you have advertisements or stories about Tuffy bags that of the children that there's real world dangers that they wouldn't otherwise encounter, especially for very young elementary school kids. School shootings receive lots and lots of media attention. It amazes me that that's the one place we haven't gotten numb to it. It doesn't make a difference if it's 6 or if it's 10 or it's 20. They get a lot of attention, and rightfully so, because it's so frightening that our kids are not safe. But that doesn't mean that these events are common. They are not very common. And so while they're a threat, the likelihood that one child would personally get affected by a school shooting is rather slim. And so we need to reassure our kids that even when we as parents are very nervous and become illogical about the risk to our kids, that they are safe at school. And because when they feel chronically threatened or chronically unsure, they are more likely to become anxious or depressed. And it's our job to manage those feelings and keep anxiety, in particular, that feeling, to a minimum, if not to eliminate it completely. Anxiety, we know, is a symptom that you should have when there's a threat. When there's a bear, right? There's a bear, it's run away from that bear or figure out a way to kill that bear. It's a protective mechanism. When it starts misfiring all the time, it becomes useless. Your kid is in a state where they can't learn, they can't sleep, they can't have fun. And so it's our job to keep this in perspective for them.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Harold. The media coverage tends to be so intense. Oftentimes it's very brief. It's everywhere and then it's gone, and we're then left to make sense of it. And that brings me to a topic that I want to make sure we don't give short shrift, which is how do we cope with our own anxiety as parents and caregivers? Can you, either of you, Harold or Lindsay, can either of you speak to your own approach to understand? You're both parents as well. Your anxiety as a parent and as a caregiver, the anxiety I feel as a parent and caregiver, and then what I do and what I'm doing, what you're doing to try to help parents of your patients. Do kids absorb our anxiety? If they do, how can we do a better job of coping ourselves so as not to negatively impact our children? What are some skills that we as parents can use to cope effectively with our anxiety in this reality that we're living in now? Either of you, please.
Lindsay, you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. So all three of us are parents, and I can share that I had a very difficult time after the Uvalde shooting, where I really had to actually actively work on kind of coping with how it impacted me. One of the things I did was I could not watch the coverage, and I really still am not able to watch kind of I haven't been able to watch or listen to the topic since. And I'm making peace with that. I think a lot of times as adults, we want to be a part of it. We feel like we cannot shut down to the atrocities, the terrible things, the injustices that happen in the world, in this country. But in reality, we're just humans, right? And we do have limits. And accepting and being okay with the limits that we each face is really important if we are going to help our kids manage what they are going through. And so often people of all ages, especially parents on this topic, we feel powerless and we feel helpless and we want to do something. And this is actually something that you can do. Everyone on this call, the three of us, we all actually can do something here that does make a difference in our little corner of the world, which is our household, our classroom, our loved ones. We can manage our own feelings so that it is not something, so that our children don't absorb more distress or kind of more distress than they already are. So I want to sort of empower folks, like, it is okay to say enough and to just focus on what's going on in your own household. And that is making a huge difference. That is something that you have power over and control. So, Matt, something that I can really relate to. And, one of another little tidbit that I found helpful was I looked for the things that were actually put in place to protect my kids. One day I went to pick up my son in the after school program, and all of a sudden the door was locked. It wasn't locked last year, but it was locked this year. And I remind myself, okay, this is one way that we know that, active shooters can find an unlocked entrance. And by having one entrance, even at 5 o'clock after school for the Y program, like that actually gave me great reassurance. So it's almost like looking for, it's the same practice and the same techniques that we encourage our children to do, that we're trying to implement ourselves. Harold, I don't know if you have others.
So I was going to say that, I'm clearly the oldest person on the screen. So I remember distinctly 9/11. And in New York, it really did affect the school system. It affected our lives. You could smell it in the air. And we became, as Americans, addicted to television. The Today Show went from 2 hours to 4 hours to 6 hours. And what they did was they kept repeating. There was no new information. So they just kept repeating itself. And we also found out that inevitably, kids started to think that the plane was going into the building again and again and again. And so it became common sense, and this is what we need to do for ourselves, is to turn the TV off. That when there's bad news on the television and you got the facts, we're done. And now, much more than during 9/11, now we have 24/7 cable news, which again repeats as you turn the TV off. If you really are that desperate to get some new news, you turn it on for 10 minutes, you figure out if you got your news or look online and figure out if there's something new. No exposure to TV for ourselves as well as our kids. And when you're feeling anxious, the way Lindsay's describing, that there's a hopelessness, there's a helplessness, there's a fear that something bad is going to happen, that feeling of dread, it's time to go to sleep on time. Make sure you're modeling that, you're going to bed by 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, you're getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep. It really makes sense, more so than ever, to exercise. If you're not a jogger, go take a walk. If you're not a big weightlifter, do some sit-ups and push-ups. Get yourself into some kind of healthy routine of sleep, of eating, of exercise. And it's a great model, by the way, for your kids too, to see that you have been able to compartmentalize and make sure that you're moving on. Now, that's after you've gotten after you got all the facts, your kid is safe, you're part of your brain that does logic, knows that everything's okay. And therefore, whether it's deep breathing, whether it's sleep, whether it's meditation, mindfulness, you're going to get the emotional part of your brain to calm down and let the wise part of your brain take over.
Those are extremely useful suggestions from both of you. I want to add one additional perspective here, and I'm curious if you all agree or not, but I also think there's a place for some emotional authenticity with our kids, provided that we are prepared to contain it. So it's okay to say to our kids, I'm really upset by this too. I find this really overwhelming and difficult. I can't believe this has happened again. I'm really confused by why this is happening. All of these honest reactions that so many of us feel, but not to process it with your kids. Not to.
I also think you said the most important thing is within certain constraints. People will always ask, should my kid be allowed at 6 or at 7 or 8 go to a funeral? Well, if you know that people are not going to get overwhelmed with emotion, no one's throwing themselves on the coffin, no one is just completely irrational and so overwhelmed with emotion that they don't look like the same person, because that's contagious. When kids see that their parents, their grandparents, their aunts and uncles are out of control, it makes them feel out of control. But you're 100% right, Matt, that being authentic and saying, I'm really upset by this. This is illogical. It's mind-boggling. I can't believe it's happening again, in a calm way. And I'm going to write to our congressman, or I'm going to get involved in the, and let the school community board know about, or whatever it is, without getting overwhelmed with emotion.
Right. And I'm going to, all the things you said as well, I'm going to talk to mom or grandma about it because they always help me to feel better. And I'm going to make sure to go out for a walk today. And I'm going to make sure I go to bed on time tonight. and let's watch our favorite show this weekend. That'll be some special time together. Things that are where you are modeling out loud, this is a healthy way to cope with something that nobody wanted to happen. So Lindsay, can I ask you, there in a moment we're going to go to questions, and I think questions will touch on this as well. But what should parents do if they believe that their child may need more help in the wake of an event like this?
Yep, it's a great question, and something that we get all the time. How do I know when anxiety is no longer normal? It's really normal for the days and maybe even weeks following an event for a child to feel to be distracted, to feel sad, feel worried, have this event on their minds. Younger kids can get, you may notice a little bit of regression or like a clinginess or a need to be kind of close to a parent. And that's really normal. Again, I will own that I felt that in the days after several tragedies where it really disrupted my day-to-day, life. If it extends beyond a couple of days, a week, and it starts disrupting normal daily functioning, so the ability to go to school and complete homework, to be a social and active with your friends and family, to sleep, eat, do the normal kind of, like Harold said, things we have to do to take care of our body, then that's when we think about it, reaching out to a professional to help. So talking to a pediatrician, talking to, a professional around your concerns. And again, a lot of our jobs as parents and all of us here as child and adolescent mental health professionals, we're teaching kids how to cope with things that are difficult, how to manage big feelings. And so, if you need help with that, ask for help. Go look for the resources in your community or, from professionals to get your child back on track. Because these are skills to learn that can be applied now and again in the future when life presents as difficult again.
Thanks, Lindsay. I want to turn to some. We have a tremendous number of great questions from the audience. I'm going to try to get to several of them. I also just want to make a sort of meta comment. We have 314 people here who are taking time out of their day to come and learn and talk about this issue. You are all, everyone who's here today is taking an active coping step to inform yourself, to get support, to get information, to get resources. This is a positive sign about each of you who's here, about how you face adversity, about how you face something that feels overwhelming. So I just want to make that comment in advance of these questions. First question, I'll pose this question to Harold. This is from an anonymous attendee. I'm trying to figure out how to authentically reassure my children on this topic when I personally am very fearful about the potential of a mass shooting in our environment. I regularly find myself canvassing my environment to assess the potential risk at the movies, at a concert, at a shopping center. The one thing I wouldn't want to do is assure them that they're safe, only to be proven wrong by some crazy person.
Right. I think this is a moment where, again, our emotional response versus our intellectual response. It is perfectly reasonable and understandable that we are emotionally worried that something bad will happen. And yet, there is always a certain amount of risk, it may be very small, but there's always amount of risk. And we have to think about this intellectually. What does it do to your child if you shared every risk out there? So there's a risk of getting sick. There's a risk of getting COVID. There's a very high risk of getting into a car accident, much higher, by the way, than a shooter coming to their school. And yet we manage to hold those fears and those worries inside of us, recognizing that sharing all of them with our child will overwhelm them, will make our child fearful of the world. And so we have to be very careful that we want our children to be able to go out into the world, enjoy school, go on play dates and enjoy their friends, go to Little League or ballet or piano lessons, and not feel that they have to look over their shoulders. And so I think it's important that as a parent to recognize that, yes, there is risk. and whether it's small or large, sharing that with your child will do them a disservice. And so sometimes holding that worry, or holding, whether it's logical or illogical, holding that worry to ourselves is really protecting our child.
Thank you, Harold. Your comment reminds me of just the way that our nervous systems are built, the way that they're wired. Our nervous systems are designed to be able to build up to handle a threat and then to settle back down. And when we get into trouble, when people develop post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety disorders, it's because their nervous systems have ramped up and have not been able to ramp back down. And when we maintain a feeling of vigilance in our environment all the time, it doesn't allow our nervous systems to come back down. And we transmit that to our kids as well. And so what you're talking about, I think, is the ability to, as an adult, to do, we're all doing some surveillance all the time for the safety of our kids. It's the burden of parenthood, right? And yet the ability to do that surveillance, and yet to at the same time be able to metabolize that, to break that down, so we're not transmitting all of that surveillance to our kids. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to our nervous systems, and it's one that we can do best with conversations like this and with support from our peers and our friends and our spouses and people around us. Lindsay, I want to move down to another question. This is from a school nurse, Robin, who says, I'm a school nurse and I'm seeing the impact of hyper-realistic active shooter drills in school. It can be traumatizing to both students and the school staff. Safety feels very fleeting right now. We want to believe that the schools are safe. What would you say to Robin?
That's a great question. I think that the idea of active shooter drills is something that, is still something we're getting used to as adults. We didn't grow up with that. But really we have to think about, okay, this is just like a fire drill. This is just like when I sit in the airplane and they go through the whole, safety spiel before we take off. We talk about crash landings. We talk about getting into the water. We talk about going out the slide and all the exits. It's not there to scare folks. It's there to really, learn a particular pattern, a routine, and be prepped, sort of ingrain that action into one's head for what if it were ever to present. Where the shooter drills get less helpful is when they are more realistic. So there's, I think that there's a trend towards adding more sensory experience and realism to shooter drills in a way that probably is quite traumatic or too much information for certain kids and adults as well. So, that I think is where the realism is likely less helpful than just the rote routine and practice and straightforward facts of like we do a fire drill.
Thanks, Lindsay. Harold, I'm going to pose this next question to you. I think this will be a familiar one. What are your suggestions to a family when one parent or caregiver has a lot of anxiety, maybe a tremendous amount of anxiety over this topic, and really doesn't want to talk about it at all? And the other parent or caregiver or someone else involved with raising the child really wants this to be something that they talk to the kids about. What suggestion would you give for that family?
So clearly, look, parents, I love when we talk about different parenting styles, that there's the autocratic parent who's all about control and no warmth. And there's the permissive parent that's all about warmth and no control. And what happens if parents if they're not lockstep? And I would tell you that it's a matter of compromise, and there should be discussion behind a closed door so the kids can't see that there's a real disagreement on how to handle something. But I think it's really important for the partners to understand where the other partner is coming from. So if someone is totally overwhelmed by the school shootings and says, this is too upsetting and I don't want to upset our child, and the other partner is saying, well, I really think it's important that we should at least open up the door to the discussion if our child wants to, I think it really takes some work to take a walk around the block or to set some time up on a Sunday or Saturday to say, let's do the pros and cons on this. And if this is something that is too upsetting for you, I can handle it. I can be the one to say, look, I know that you heard about this. You have any questions about it? If you do, please don't hesitate to ask me, and I'll tell you what I know. And the other parent can say when the child comes to them and say, mom's really the expert on this, or dad's really the experts on this. So why don't we wait until they come home? And those are important questions and you should ask them, so that you are not forcing a parent who does not feel comfortable to start discussing this. It's always a mistake. It comes across as rigid, it comes across as cautious or overly cautious, which just makes the kid more anxious, because why aren't they talking to me about it? When it's easier if you have a deal set beforehand and you're able to say, dad's going to answer those questions, or I agree with whatever dad said. I'm 100% behind it.
Super, thank you. I'm already, speaking of anxiety, my anxiety is welling up in me because we don't have much time left, and there's so many good questions. There are fantastic. I hope that people are seeing the questions in the chat. Questions about cultural factors that come into play, questions that have to do with communities that are afflicted with violence all the time. And school shootings are just another version of threat and trauma that face communities. I'm hoping we get to some of these questions as well. I do want to call on a couple of parents or attendees who have their hands up, just to hear directly from you. Patricia, can you speak up now?
She seems frozen.
If maybe Patricia's not available. Another hand up was from Natasha. I'm not sure whether it may not be possible for people to unmute themselves. Maybe that's the issue. Lindsay, will you peek at that? Well, and I'm going to go to another question as well. Thank you very much. At the same time, while we're looking to see if we can unmute people, I'm going to bring up the issue that I alluded to before. So in many communities, particularly communities of color, community violence is a daily threat to safety and well-being, and school shootings are sort of an additive threat to that. And I wonder about the advice or perspective you might share as clinicians with families with regard to safety, with regard to things that families talk about, and trying to establish a degree of cohesion within a family when there are so many pervasive threats that they might be facing.
And do you want to take it, or you want me to? Okay. We do know that there is an additive effect to how much stress a child can have. It's almost, people know about this as ACEs. How many adverse events can a child tolerate? Now, there are kids out there that are super resilient, whether it's because they just have super resilient genes, or the genetic, makeup, or the nurturing they've been getting just makes them have things roll off their back. But most kids, there is a limit to how much they can tolerate. So if they're exposed to shootings or violence at home, being beaten or watching someone being beaten, if there are more gun episodes in the street, if there's poverty so that they may not have enough food to eat, and then they go to a school which is unsafe, there is no doubt we're going to find a child who has a part of their brain, the amygdala, which is it's the alarm center, that's going off unnecessarily. And so if you look at that person in the wrong way, they are much more likely to, hit someone, or to be aggressive, or to overreact. So one of the reasons why these school shootings are not equal opportunity is that if they are occurring in an environment where there was already a high level of violence, and instability, that you had kids who weren't confident that they were safe, you'll see that there'll be more violence in the school. There'll be more episodes of aggression between students, aggression toward a teacher. And while I'm not excusing it, it just becomes more understandable why that is happening. It's not a matter of bad kids. It's frankly a matter of an unacceptable environment that we're exposing our children to.
Thanks, Harold. I'll just add briefly to that, because I think it's such an important question. And unfortunately, for many communities raising kids in this country, violence is a very present part of life, because of race, and because of other factors as well. And I think that in my clinical experience, for example, many Black families are unfortunately quite expert, quite adept at talking about risk with their kids. Talking when their kids get a driver's license for the first time, talking about the risk of going onto the roads as a young Black person behind the wheel, it comes with real, prominent, and present risk. And so I think, unfortunately, this adds to the list of things that we have to talk to our kids about. And again, many parents and many communities are much more experienced with this than others. I think we can probably all learn from one another about how to reach our kids, how to create a sense of responsibility and of awareness, and yet not tip into overwhelming our kids with the sense that the danger is ever present, because it's very hard to live with the sense that danger is ever present. Along those lines, and this will be, I think this will be our last question, then we'll start to wrap up. And I'm going to merge together several questions here because several are convergent. Both of you have talked tonight about how these incidents are quite common. They feel ever present. They're happening every day. At the same time, the absolute risk for any given family or any given community is still lower than other things like motor vehicle accidents or assault or other kinds of trauma, not to mention some of the other things that kids deal with every day, bullying and other factors that affect kids' mental health. How do you think about balancing being realistic about risk and safety when talking to families? And there's even a parent on this call or an attendee on this call who themselves and their spouse were both survivors of school shootings. So this is not academic. This is not a faraway risk. This is a very real and present risk. And yet we know numerically, as you said, Harold, driving in a car is much more dangerous on a numerical basis. So how do we make sense of that psychologically and emotionally, these conflicting facts?
Yeah, I'm so glad we're ending on this, Matt, because I really think it's a tough question. Harold, you touched on it, this idea of holding both at the same time, that we can never guarantee or make promises to ourselves, to our children, to our spouses. We can't, and for depending on a developmental age, we really shouldn't, right? That our job is to hold both, that there is a risk about just being a human, right? Whether our hearts are broken or we get hurt or something tragic happens to us, that part of our developmental and really, existential, tasks in life is to just sit with that, to tolerate both of those things, that the world can never be a guaranteed safe place, and to model for yourself, for those around you, for your children, that you can still kind of proceed, that you can experience and enjoy life, that you are not so afraid that you avoid the things that could potentially harm you, because the alternative is really a quite limited, isolated, lonely life. Now, that may mean as parents that you have to address your own stuff, right? That you have to work through your own things and process what's gone on for you first before you can authentically and genuinely kind of live in that message. But I think that it's a bigger kind of a challenge than just this. It's just sort of tolerating life and letting our children kind of go forth into the world, which is a very scary task as a parent.
Indeed. Harold, any last thoughts for us?
So I would just have to tell you that I think it's really upsetting that we ignore gun violence, right? It's not only repugnant, it's in many ways, it's so un-American. I remember people talking about when I was a kid what polio was like, and polio disappeared. We cured polio. I remember as a kid being put into a car for a carpool where they throw 6 or 7 of us in for Sunday school in the back of a station where we were knocking around. Today, my kids wouldn't enter a taxi without putting a safety belt on. So a country that dealt with the Great Depression, a country that took on car safety, that took on childhood leukemia, that we are a country that has stick-to-itiveness and solves problems. And the fact that we won't do that with gun safety, I think, is a failure as a nation and a failure as a parent. I don't believe any parent in the United States, even parents who like to hunt or parents who believe that the Second Amendment really gives them a right to have a gun, I don't believe any parent in America thinks that someone who is a criminal, someone who is a child or immature, or someone who has erratic behavior should have a gun. And that just seems like basic common sense. And when we say to our kids, you're the most important things in our lives, you're the future of America, and we don't take action, we don't write to our congressman, we don't say, I want my gun, I want to be able to go hunting, I'm responsible, I lock it safely, but I do not want a country where you can buy a gun without a screening or a check about someone's mental health, or there isn't a safety period while you have asked for the gun and you have to wait 24 hours or 48 hours, which I don't understand why that's such a big deal. You order something on Amazon, it can take 24, 40 hours a week, and we don't die. That this is a terrible message that we're giving to our children. No matter if you are a gun lover or you are an opponent of wanting guns in a house, America knows that when you have a gun in the house, you are more likely to have a bad episode with suicide, homicide, or a gun accident. And in America, that's our home, and our children live in that house. And there are 400 million guns. So we're not going to get rid of guns. We're not talking about taking people's guns away, but we should have common sense gun safety in the same way that my kids put on a safety belt and I didn't have that, or the same way that you get a vaccine for polio so people are not dying in iron lungs. And I think as parents who are worried about our children, it makes common sense that that's the action we should take as citizens, to say gun safety, not necessarily gun control, but gun safety. We have to be responsible about this, and we don't want to put guns in the hands of irresponsible people.
Harold, thank you. And I know you agree with me as a psychiatrist. We're glad to hear more interest in mental health and mental illness, but it's just wrong to attribute the gun violence problem to mental health problems. Mental health
Correct.
problems.
And we know, look, Matt, we know the statistics. We know that people who do have mental health disorders are more likely to hurt themselves than hurt anybody else. We also know that there are millions and millions of people with mental health disorders around the world. And yet America is the only place where we have these mass school shootings or these mass shootings. So the differential is the fact that we're not being responsible in how we are putting guns in the hands of people who aren't responsible. And, if we care about our children, we take driver's license away from people who are drunk and drive. We just say, you can't go home behind a wheel because you're a danger to others. And I think it's the same simple safety to say, if you can't pass this test, if you can't pass this screening, because you have a criminal record, you can't have a gun. But to blame it on mentally ill, I think is, I feel scapegoated as a mental health professional, that's the only time they want to talk to me on national television is when, there's been a mass school shooting.
Exactly. Thank you for coming out so strongly about that. I entirely agree. And I want to thank everyone for joining this session. I'm so sorry that we didn't get to more of your beautiful questions. There was a lot of great engagement and a lot of very thought-provoking questions. Please share feedback via the form that Shai shared so that we can get your input about future sessions that we might hold on this topic and on other topics as well. We hope to be able to continue this dialogue and this way of convening. Thanks so much. Wishing everyone a good evening.